Hello gamers, Power Heal here, and welcome to the Classic Plus Corner. This is a segment of the channel where we discuss all things related to WoW Classic Plus. This will be episode 16, and today we'll be discussing raid bosses and the damage they deal, particularly the damage to the tank. And how we decide to kind of go about things is we're going to go to the Classic Plus Project website, the one that we talked about a couple days ago. And, I'm just kind of browsing there, checking some of the topics. And when I come across something that I find interesting, I'll make a video about it. And we're also have, ideas of our own. But I wanted to discuss some of the things on this website as I think it's kind of interesting. So I found this thread here, and I'm going to read it out to you. And we're going to do it in two parts. We're going to kind of analyze the actual claim being made first. And then we're going to get into, philosophically speaking, what do I think should be the actual case in Classic Plus. So we'll kind of get right into it. And the title is Raid Bosses Should Actually Do Damage to the Tank. In Classic WoW, most raid bosses are a joke to tanks. Even slightly geared warrior or druid tanks can survive multiple back-to-back critical hits and/or crushing blows and not have to worry about dying. Part of this is because the massive health pools granted by world buffs and overpowered consumes like Flask of the Titans, but part of this is also because bosses just flat out deal a pathetic amount of damage. As a result of this, warrior tanks don't even fully spec into the protection tree. They mostly wear Fury DPS gear. Druid tanks are also in a similar boat where they really have to gear very defensively. Raid bosses across all tiers should be retuned to be a threat to tanks like they are in TBC, necessitating tank players to spec, gear, and play defensively. Do you feel strongly about this topic? Add to the discussion in the Discord thread using the link below. So I think the last part is kind of the auto message there, but you get the gist of what he's saying. So I want to analyze this by first going over the reality of that statement. Is it true that the bosses basically all hit like wet noodles in vanilla? And I think this is a bit of a hyperbole and a bit of an exaggeration. Clearly each boss in every raid is somewhat different. I feel like in the damage they deal to the tank, I think like they're typically clustered by the type of boss. So for example, in MC, the Naga bosses mostly deal kind of like a similar amount of damage to the tank. And then you have bosses like Golemag, which kind of stand out and do more damage. Gar can do a reasonable amount of damage, but realistically it's more Gar in the adds in a lot of cases that kind of pile up to do combined damage. And do I think the damage is too little overall? Not really. I actually think the tank damage is pretty good in WoW Classic, and it's kind of like one of the strengths of the game in terms of designing the healing, right? I think that there's a point of confusion that often gets made, though, and I can kind of understand why this person is kind of viewing things through the lens of it just being too easy to heal tanks. And I think that it comes down to roughly two factors. So the first one is that there's not many other threats, especially in a lot of the early bosses in WoW Classic. So if you think back to MC and Blackwing Lair, a lot of it is kind of just focus your healing on the tank, if that makes sense, right? And you have an abundance of healers to do this as well. So individually, you're not necessarily feeling like you're playing TBC and you're pumping up that tank's HP. You have a lot less healers per player in TBC typically, so you can feel the impact more when a tank gets hit hard, especially if you're the person actually healing the tank. So I think this is one thing that you want to consider here when talking about this topic. But the other thing is that the tanks themselves are getting spammed constantly in Classic by tons of heals. And this kind of leans back into the other point. But what does that mean? Well, the fights are super short for the most part in Classic, right? They're much longer in TBC. And what does that allow? Well, it means you can really afford to dump your mana on the tank. So you can kind of like overheal a lot. And when you can overheal a lot, it also adds to that feeling of kind of tank safety, right? Because heals are constantly coming in on the tank no matter what. And there's no downside to doing this because the fight is in some cases 30 seconds to a minute, right? So of course, you can kind of have your warrior in DPS gear, and they're getting crit and crushed and everything under the sun. If they're getting, just completely pounded on heal-wise, you have everybody in the raid focusing them with heals. In terms of the actual raw damage, I mean, if warrior goes, full DPS, or not necessarily full DPS, but wears a great amount of DPS gear, especially some of the leather gear, and isn't crit capped, I mean, you can feel that damage. Now, there's certain bosses where it becomes more threatening than others. I think that this is also a part of where he's going with this, right? It's unlikely that Golemag is going to one-shot your kind of standard Fury Prot tank, right? But I've seen Nefarian one-shot Fury Prot tanks. I've seen Broodlord one-shot Fury Prot tanks that weren't using every consumable under the sun. And the consumable thing that he mentions there, he mentions it, but it's a little bit underrated, I think. Just the amount of raw consumables you can use in WoW Classic for both health and mitigation. This kind of also tends to go down in expansions that come after, and I think that it has a chance to go down in Classic Plus as well. You're probably not going to be coming into raid with quite as many consumables, and these things make a difference, right? Because all you really need in WoW Classic is to survive long enough to not get one shot, and the expectation is that you are going to be brought back entirely to full, based on the principle I talked about before, where most of the healing on a boss fight, especially in the earlier boss fights, is really tank healing for the most part. Right, and so many people are focused on tank healing and are trying to snipe the healing on the tank that you have a constant stream of heals coming in all the time, and it really does make the tank feel safe in sort of a unique way to other versions of the game, because you don't even really have to think about it as much. I'm trying to do a comparison to other Classic raids, but think about something like Classic Wrath of the Lich King, and think about some of the bosses that hit really hard in that version of the game, like Algalon, or the beast fight in Trial of the Grand Crusade. And if you're healing that fight, it's a little bit more stressful than even healing some of the quote-unquote stressful Classic healing fights like Broodlord, right? And that tends to be because in Classic, something like Broodlord really just comes down to, do you get one shot or do you not? Because if you don't get one shot, you're basically getting brought back to full because there's so many eyes on you, right? But in something like Wrath of the Lich King, you can actually get behind on these very high damage dealing bosses just because there's not as many raw healers dumping heals onto the tank. There's also kind of more of a healer economy at play in terms of the mana, where you can actually go on these fights, right? If you're in a guild in WoW Classic and you're just trying to down a boss, there's no way you're kind of going on the fight by just spamming heals for that 30 to 60 second duration. Most of the time, it's going to be because you're trying to do a speed run or something of the sort. So I think when you kind of combine these factors, the tank damage in Classic isn't as far off as he's making it out to be. And even some of the bosses in Naxx, just to give you a little bit of an example, like Hygen, that can be a dangerous boss, in particular because of his curse. So like once he reduces the max health, you really notice that because his auto attacks are strong. He can actually kind of one-shot the tank when the tank is under a curse, right? Another thing, too, is that not all Fury Prot is created equal, right? Especially in this Anniversary release. I'm not sure if this person played Anniversary or not, but Fury Prot got like a huge buff, in my opinion, because of the ease and availability of the rank 14 gear, right? So if you were to kind of do a version of Classic Plus where there was no PvP gear at all, where either the player didn't have access to it or, it was just too expensive for your average player, the time investment, what would actually happen is you'd see a lot more tank deaths of people trying to go Fury Prot, because the PvP gear is just excellent in terms of it provides great damage, it provides great survivability, and it provides great armor, right? So the implication here is that they can go full Fury, and it's kind of true to some degree, but most people aren't going like full Fury DPS. And when they kind of are using those pieces, they tend to be the good crossover pieces, right? They're pieces that are great for Fury, and they're great for tanking. So, yeah, I think that he's a little bit off base in terms of the gear. It's not like you have people that are draped in, like, leather, running out to tank Broodlord or tank Patchwork. If you were to do that, if you were to use, like, a very squishy DPS set to try and tank bosses like that, you would die. If you do that on Nefarian, you would get splatted, especially on something like Warrior Call. So there is definitely a degree of players optimizing for the right balance of threat and the right balance of damage. And it mostly just comes down to the fact that a lot of these fights end so quickly that you can afford to take more risks in order to push the threat cap a little bit greater. And comparing this over to TBC, it's almost sort of the opposite. There's really no reason to take as many risks, right? Because you actually have much better threat generation in TBC to begin with. So there's less of a need to kind of spec into actual raw offensive gear in order to make your raid work, essentially, right? So a couple thoughts on the topic of, is this the reality of the situation? Now, philosophically speaking, do we really want things hitting the tank super hard? And in my opinion, I actually vote no on this. And a lot of people are probably going to be like, oh, that's lame. And I think that this comes from a strand of elitism, and I don't use that word in a negative way. I get it, right? I've been on the elitism side of the elitism arguments. It feels good to be able to heal something that other people seem to struggle with, right? And I think that the best way to create that struggle is tend to have either, a lot of AoE damage going out, right? Make people make really hard decisions really quickly, or make it really challenging to actually keep the tank alive. Make it something you have to really babysit him. You have to be cancel casting on him. You have to be anticipating damage, right? I think those are two great ways, Power Heals Phone, to really make things difficult for a healer in WoW Classic in particular. Retail kind of goes a little bit of a different route because the game itself is just a lot harder, right? Healers, to some degree, are doing the mechanics that the rest of the raid has to do, so they're having to heal while doing those mechanics, and healing just kind of functions way differently in that version of the game. It's kind of more about using your cooldowns, using your abilities to generate a large amount of throughput in certain burst windows, right, to kind of cover for particular moments of the raid where everybody's taking a lot of damage. In WoW Classic, they tend to do things a bit differently, and the tank damage is certainly one lever they can use to kind of adjust healing difficulty. But why am I not as big of a fan of that, right? Well, as much as it feels good to kind of be able to, kind of down content that other people struggle with, the reality is that I think it's actually more fun to have a little bit more freedom in terms of your healing, right? The more strictly you buff tank damage or tank damage taken, right? So the more they have to be babysat, the more you're kind of just sitting on one target and healing them over and over and over again. It also makes it so that the manner in which you heal them has to be more formulaic, right? So you can't freeform as much if your tank is basically designed to be pushed to the maximum amount of damage taken and the maximum amount of healing needed, right? At that point, think about theoretically what it would take to heal a tank that is being pushed to the very brink of how much damage he can take, right? You might technically need full hots on him, or things like Earth Shield, depending on the game, for a shaman, while you have people bombing heals on him. So basically a tank would require all these extra resources on him all the time, and instead of it being kind of like a utility thing where you decide, I'm going to use this to solve this problem, maybe I use some hots in the tank here on this fight that's, he's not really getting that blasted, and then instead I'll focus my efforts on the raid. And I think gameplay like that is more kind of emergent and fun than just sitting there and tunneling the tank 24/7, right? And the most fun I've had is when I'm in a raid where I'm able to kind of flex off the tank, even though I'm a person who, even when I'm not assigned to the tank, I'm kind of always looking at the tank, because a big reason for wipes in Classic WoW, outside of just pure failure to mechanics, is definitely tank going down. I feel like that's a pretty common wipe condition. So with that being in mind, I'm kind of always looking at the tanks no matter my assign. But I like the fact that I can kind of flex off the tank in most cases. There's still kind of enough room there where if the tank is having a good streak of mitigation, I can hot swap onto somebody else, do a nice spot heal, and then be ready to swap back to the tank. And when you have tanks taking extreme amount of damage, you just can't really do that, right? Because you need to be ready all the time at any given moment to be able to heal even the smallest amount of damage that goes on them, because the next hit could be their last. So I think ultimately it's a very boring playstyle, and I understand, again, that it kind of makes you feel good when you're healing this fight that maybe other people can't heal or struggle to heal, and I get that. But ultimately, I think it's more fun to just have a situation where you're doing a lot more kind of spot healing. You can be a lot more flexible with your heals, and the focal point of the fight isn't just spamming heals on the tank, making sure he survives. And I think that also doing this kind of makes healing more accessible. The more you create this thing where it's the tank can just be one shot at any point, it just adds a lot of stress to the role, and a lot of people don't want to deal with that stress. and there's already not a lot of healers in the game, to be honest, right? It's already a struggle to get healers sometimes, and making the role, I think there's a struggle in terms of getting people to play healer intrinsically, right? To get people to play a support class in general. Like, for an example, in League of Legends, support is one of the most powerful roles, yet there's, barely, I think the fewest amount of the player base, even kind of like lower ELOs, want to play support, which is a very interesting dynamic, right? And it's kind of brought over to healing in WoW Classic as well, where there's just always a lack of healers. And the more you increase the stress level, it's not going to do anything to solve that problem, right? If anything, it's going to make it worse. You might get, like, on average, better healers from something like this, but you're going to have less of them, which just means it's going to be way more annoying to actually do content, right? And I think if you want to see tanks in tank gear, which I completely agree with, by the way, I think that the best thing to do is tune their innate threat to be higher, right? I'm not sure that I love threat as a kind of knob that we tune in order to adjust the type of gear, like the mitigation gear that somebody's wearing on a fight. In some ways, it's kind of cool, right? To think, hey, there's actually a meaningful distinction here in balancing tank survivability versus how much throughput they do in a way that doesn't just come down to, oh, the tank just did a little bit more damage, right? Because regardless of what people think about this issue, I don't think in Classic Plus that we're going to have a situation where, fights are being decided by the main tank doing 5% extra damage, right? So if there's a opportunity to get tankier or do more damage in a case where threat is already solved, most players are just going to get tankier, right? Unless, obviously, building into DPS allows you to do way more damage, which I don't think will be the case. So I think the best way to kind of fix this problem is to just make it so that you do a lot more baseline threat as a tank. Some people might not like this. It doesn't necessarily have to be like retail levels of how easy it is to maintain aggro, but there needs to be a buff, right? You shouldn't be kind of having to flex into DPS off pieces in order to get threat. The margin should not be that small. I think if the margin's not that small, most players are going to opt to go tank, right? This is kind of what happens in TBC because you could build more damage, right, for more threat. You could still do that in TBC, but in a lot of cases, it's just not needed as much. So it's like, why would you bother taking the risk when you can make things way easier on your healers, right? And I think if you do that, then people are going to be back into tank gear regardless, and it's going to create even more of a buffer, right? Now, one thing you could do that kind of speaks to this problem here is you could change the formula so that when somebody gets kind of crit or crushed, it does way more damage than even now, to a tank at least, or to like a player, I guess, in the raid. So that could be an interesting way to solve this problem, because that way you can't just go like full DPS regardless. You would get absolutely shredded. Kind of like in TBC, like if you're not somewhere near crit cap, I believe, in the heroic dungeons, right, you're just going to get absolutely worked over. You could do something like that, where you almost increase the crit multiplier on those things, or increase the damage of getting crushed, just to make it a bit more consequential to completely ignore the prescribed notion of building a bit tankier. And that feels a bit weird for people, right? Because a lot of Classic is player choice, and some people find it really interesting that Fury Pro kind of emerged out of everything. But like I said, ultimately, I think this one would be better if the tank just had better baseline threat, and then he could just worry about mitigation a bit more. And yeah, I think that would just be better for the game. So maybe I'm at odds with you guys on this one. Maybe you guys want super spiky tank damage, but ultimately I just don't think it's that interesting. I think it's much more interesting when you can have somebody kind of react and cover the whole raid. They can do more spot healing. Way more fun from my experience. Let me know what you guys think. I know we got a lot of healers in here, and I will talk to you guys next time. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed this, and talk to you later.